Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court, and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common-sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
Hey, you know what would make your customer service help desk way better? Dumping it and then switching to intercom. But you're not quite ready to make that change. We get it. That's why Finn, the world's leading AI customer service agent, is now available on every help desk. Finn can instantly resolve up to 80% of your tickets, which makes your customers happier and gets you off the customer service rep hiring treadmill. Finn by Intercon, the leading customer service AI agent, now available on every help desk.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm very delighted to be joined today by the eminent crime novelist Christopher Brookmyre and his wife Dr. Marisa Haetzman, who together write under the pen name of Ambrose Parry, a series of, are we on book number 4 now, is that right? Five.
Yeah.
So Victorian era medical based detective novels. I think I've kind of covered all bases there, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, we're going to really focus on not doing any spoiler alerts for anyone that wants to get the forthcoming book, The Death of Shame. But perhaps what we can do is, to begin with, hear from you guys a little bit about the book, also a little bit about, you know, the research that goes into it and that kind of thing. And then we'll dive in and we'll look at the big historical picture. So over to you guys. Tell us about the book.
Well, the Death of Shame is set in Edinburgh in 1854, and the Edinburgh setting in all the books is very important. Edinburgh was really important in the history of medicine. It had a world-famous medical school in the mid-19th century, and it produced a number of very famous doctors, surgeons like James Syme. There's the pioneer of chloroform who features in all the books, Dr. James Young Simpson. And so that's the kind of setting for the books. But this book, The Death of Shame, the main protagonist is a young doctor called Will Raven, who has been apprenticed to Dr. Simpson and worked as his assistant for a number of years, is now trying to set up practice on his own, along with his friend Sarah Fisher, who started off as Simpson's housemaid, but has now developed ambitions to study medicine herself, which is very difficult, almost impossible to do in mid-19th century United Kingdom. So she has offered to fund the setting up of Raven's practice so that he can teach her what he knows, largely in secret, but that's kind of the setup. And then do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the plot of the book, the kind of crime mystery?
Yeah, Raven is asked to investigate a death at the Scott Monument in Edinburgh, that someone has thrown themselves apparently from the Scott Monument. It turns out to be a fairly prominent doctor, and Raven, in looking into why someone might do this, it sort of takes him into an area of blackmail, sexual hypocrisy, which was rife in the middle of the 19th century. What was interesting to me actually is that looking at the history of blackmail prior to that, in the earlier part of the 19th century, it was predominantly blackmailing people for homosexual activity. It takes until really the Victorian era and its sexual hypocrisy for heterosexual blackmail to be a vulnerable target, because suddenly it becomes important to be an upstanding Christian married man with an unimpeachable reputation. Prior to that, the great hypocrisy was women could be blackmailed over their sexual behaviour, but men pretty much couldn't, because it was almost like a sign of virility prior to that.
Yeah.
So anyway, the book starts to look into that, but in tandem, there's Sarah has a relative turn up and say that Sarah's niece has gone missing. She was supposed to take up a position as a nursemaid at an Edinburgh house, and it's been about a month, and there's been no word from her. So Sarah begins to investigate, and that's what leads us into the realm of essentially sex trafficking and the modification of virginity that was taking place around then.
Because there is, in the kind of the mid 19th century, service for working class service in middle class kind of bourgeois homes is this kind of it's mark of kind of middle class respectability. And there are all sorts of things, things like Mrs. Beeton's book of household management it's not a book of recipes, it's a book of how to make the staff do what you want and how to manage them and that kind of thing. So and service between then and the First World War is one of the main sources of employment for young working class women, and there's this flow particularly from the land to the city. And so here, what we've got, and again, not wanting to kind of do any spoilers, but there is a kind of that's sort of part of the kind of the flow of sex trafficking, isn't it? Women lured away from working class homes with the offer of good employment in service, but that's not where they end up.
Often intercepted, because when we researched this, they were often intercepted at railway stations, because they turn up with their box, which it was always put as their box rather than a case, and these men would offer to escort them, or sometimes tell them they had been sent to escort them, and they would take them to houses where sometimes they would be told ostensibly that this was a place of work, but they would be told then that they owed rent, and there was the rent that they owed would constantly go up, so that the only way to earn it back was prostitution.
Right. And once a young Victorian woman is in that cycle, they can't get out of it. There is the sort of shame and kind of disgrace means that they're stuck in it. And
one of the things that's actually used to keep them there is being told very quickly, once they've been raped, essentially, their character is now gone. They've been ruined, is the term that keeps getting used in contemporary literature, and so they can't expect to find any other source of employment. So certainly, because the people who run the brothels will make sure any prospective employer knows that's where they came from, and it makes them completely controlled. Sure.
And there are obviously huge parallels with how we live now, and there is a modern flow of sex traffic both within the UK and globally that works in remarkably similar ways. Remarkably similar ways. Okay. So I'm right thinking, Marisa, you're part of your kind of academic work is you've done a master's degree in the history of medicine. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And this particular moment in history, I mean, I think there are two things happening at this time. There's kind of changes in surgical health and changes in public health as well. You know, you're coming out of a huge, horrendous cholera, series of cholera epidemics.
Yeah.
But am I correct in thinking that at this moment there's sort of antiseptic and anesthetics are the two things that begin to sort of transform medicine?
Yeah, yeah. Anesthetics came first, and they did transform things, obviously mainly for the patients who'd had to suffer procedures without anesthetics prior to that. And it transformed childbirth, probably made it safer. And because operations could now be performed, longer operations could be performed, you would have thought that that would have immediately led to improvements in surgery, but it actually didn't, because the big risk of surgery was infection. And so
Right.
it really took, in subsequent decades, antisepsis and the understanding of the beginnings of the understanding of bacteriology and what was causing sepsis before surgery really took off. So it was the combination of the two things that led to improvements in surgery.
Okay. And there's some interesting themes in the book around, obviously, the main female protagonists not being able to practice medicine. Were the kind of the barriers to that mainly sort of kind of, you know, cultural and institutional, sort of boys' club sort of stuff, or were there sort of really hard and fast laws to kind of prohibit that, or is it sort of more informal?
I think it was largely cultural. I think, especially in the Victorian period, there was almost like a sanctification of the woman of the house role. That the woman was the angel of the house, that her role was very much domestic. She was in charge of bearing children and bringing up children and basically keeping her husband in order. It was seen as her role to make sure that her husband remained a good Christian man. Yeah. And if he fell from grace in that respect, it was her fault. Yeah. So women's roles were very strictly circumscribed in the Victorian period. They were considered to be intellectually inferior to men. That was a long-standing thing. That they were too delicate, too sensitive to take on advanced education. So they were not allowed to study at any university because it was just considered to be wrong. And then medicine, obviously, added to that was the subject matter was definitely deemed inappropriate for women to deal with. So it was absolutely cultural, but I think there was probably also another element to this, in that medicine was a very competitive field for trying to earn a living. Yeah. And so there was a kind of protectionist attitude as well, that this had to remain a male dominion, because if you let women in as well, then the competition got even stiffer for clients and money and so on. But I think largely it was cultural.
So there's a huge amount there invested. This, I mean, partly I suppose you know, if you look from the 18th into the 19th century, you see the development of medicine as a profession as well. Yeah. You know, the further back you go, the more it's the kind of, you know, have a go amateurism. But because it becomes codified through science and it becomes officially recognized as a kind of you know, knowledge of the body and all this kind of stuff, it becomes officially recognized as a professional field in its own right. The first thing in a kind of like a patriarchal, chauvinistic society is going to happen there is that men will colonize it and ring fence it because it's a thing of value. And it becomes a thing of social prestige as well. You know, I kind of my grandmother, who was born during the First World War, in, you know, the northwest of England, to her the kind of the deference that one had towards the doctor was absolute. You know, the doctor had sort of replaced the priest almost in the kind of community. And so this is if you're a Victorian man, this is a nice gig to have, you know. There is, and if you look at all sorts of other professions, it's a sort of, you know, there is this anxiety amongst men that women are going to disrupt the gentleman's club. And I think that when you look at the kind of the history of suffrage, a lot of, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but a lot of it can kind of be sort of figured like that. And you talk, am I right in thinking, is it in just this book or in the series of books, figures from sort of like figures based on quite well-known suffragettes? Well, the suffragettes don't come along at this point, but suffrage figures kind of are there in the narrative, is that right?
Well, certainly in this book, there is a character who is based on the feminist and social welfare campaigner Josephine Butler.
Yeah.
We read a lot about Josephine Butler and her campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Act. And she was a very outspoken feminist. I know that the term wasn't used then, but she was very much an outspoken feminist, and there was a few like her. But what also interested me in reading about her and her campaigning was the number of women who were very much against it. There was like the counter campaign to say that women didn't want to vote, and women were quite happy with their domestic duties and didn't want anything else.
Yeah.
Very, very significantly, with regards to what we've just discussed, among those opposed to it were the Blackwell sisters, who were two of the first women to be allowed to practice medicine. And we were, I think, quite disappointed when we sort of dug into their story, because they had overcome such opposition, both of them. And it was Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to be on the General Medical Register. And she had managed to do this by going to America. And
Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court, and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
The new Huggies Snug & Dry are luxuriously soft and ultra-dry. How soft are we talking? Unbelievably soft, irresistibly soft. Doesn't your baby deserve a diaper that's oh so gentle on their tushy? Huggies Snug & Dry helps keep them comfy, cozy, and protected. Experience the unexpected softness and up to 100% leak protection. More parents choose the new Huggies Snug & Dry softness versus the leading premium diaper. Huggies, we got you, baby.
Welcome to It Takes Energy, presented by Energy Transfer, where we talk all things oil and natural gas. Oil and gas drive our economy, ensure our country's security, and open pathways to brighter futures. What do you know about oil and natural gas? You likely associate them with running your car or heating your home. But these two natural resources fuel so much more than that. More than 6,000 consumer products that we rely on every day are made using oil and gas. Before you even step out the door in the morning, you've already used more products made possible because of oil and gas than you realize. From the toothpaste you brush your teeth with, the soap you washed your face with, and the sheets you slept on. Not to mention your makeup, contact lenses, clothes, and shoes. Oil and gas are vital parts of all these products and so many more. Look around and you'll see the essential role oil and gas plays in our lives. Our world needs oil and gas, and people rely on us to deliver it. To learn more, visit energytransfer.com.
been permitted to study there almost as a novelty, but you've never seen a more comprehensive case of pulling the ladder up as her and her sister, and their language that they use about other women. I think they see women as a kind of pathetic subgroup that they are somehow above. And what's the quote about? They were objecting to suffrage.
I think Elizabeth said she didn't see why women should get the vote because most of them were incapable of independent thought.
Well, there is. This is not unknown. This kind of, as you put it, Christopher, pulling the ladder up. I mean, there was a certain, within the later sort of suffragette movement, and this doesn't kind of typify all of it, but there was a certain sentiment of, rights for ladies. You don't want the great unwashed having the vote. And also, I mean, if you look at other historical moments, the kind of the sort of Equal Rights Amendment Act struggle in America in the 1970s, in people like Phyllis Schlafly, who radicalized an entire generation of women against their own interests, to campaign to have fewer rights. And there are, I think what you get is some women that do very well out of moves towards greater emancipation, and then they say, "Wow, things are all right, really, aren't they? Look, I've done okay." And that they, refuse or just don't see things in a wider social context, or there is. I mean, I don't know whether this has come up in any of your writing on the era as well. But one of the kind of the most powerful ideas that keeps social injustices in general entrenched throughout the Victorian era is this notion of self-help as a kind of a theory of poverty. And it's where the bourgeoisie say to the working classes, well, if you didn't drink and you saved money and you were a bit less loutish and kind of a bit more educated, then you'd be like us, and if you come
in the Netflix and lattes, the modern version of exactly the same sentiment.
Absolutely. If these young people didn't have avocado on toast, they could afford 4-bedroom houses in Hampstead Heath. It's that kind of thing. And I was reading various books on Tudor poverty, and there are echoes of it even then. It's their fault, isn't it? And anyway. But back to the point. So I think Josephine Butler's a really interesting character as well, because and I come at it from the perspective of when I used to teach this subject, one really focuses narrowly on the questions of female suffrage, getting the vote. But women's emancipation from the mid-19th century onwards is about a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean, and questions around getting the franchise come slightly later on. But I think Josephine Butler was a campaigner against what was called white slavery, which is a pretty unpleasant term, because it's sort of presupposed that either black slavery is sort of okay or it's being dealt with, and white slavery, white slavery means prostitution. And so she had this much broader social vision of issues that affect women. And is that partly why you chose her, or a sort of like a version of her, to be the character in the story?
Yeah, I think so. I think because the story was dealing with prostitution, I think, and because she was campaigning to repeal the Contagious Diseases Act, which was a huge issue for feminists in the mid-19th century, because the act entitled police officers to forcibly have women examined, forcibly have suspected prostitutes examined, and then retained in locked hospitals for the treatment of venereal disease to stop its spread. But the police were at liberty to decide who was a suspected prostitute. This led to all sorts of awfulness happening to random women. And of course, Josephine Butler's dispute about all this was the inequality of how this was being policed, and that it was all on women. Nothing happened to the man. Nothing happened. No restrictions were placed on men to do with the spread of venereal disease. And this also, because my interest is very medical, the lock hospitals, they were called, which were special hospitals where women who were diseased were sent and basically kept incarcerated and treated with mercury until they were deemed cured. And they were also, there was also a lot of attempts at rehabilitation. Yeah. But certainly in the Edinburgh Lock Hospital, James Simpson had a big problem with the board of directors because he said that there was too much emphasis on the moral re-education of the women and not enough focus on medical treatment. And I think that was another part of the issue, that these subclass women had to be re-educated about, you know, good morals and Christian behaviour and so on, not taking into account the desperate situations that they were often in.
And with Josephine Butler, I think partly that's why we were attracted to her and her activities, because she, although she was devoutly Christian and she keeps referring to her Christianity as a driving force, she was divorcing that from the kind of moral imperative that a lot of other campaigners might have been driven by. She'd keep stressing that, I can't remember how she puts it, but she's basically saying you're not going to cure people of sexual desire, you know, and nor should we be seeing that as the problem. You know, she's regarded a lot of the other campaigners as seeing, when they referred to vice, they just disapproved of sex. And that it was a short path between disapproving of sex to then disapproving of women generally. So she sees it about as a matter of improving the lot of women, and it's not about a moral agenda. And I think that was what made her more compelling as a inspirational figure.
Yeah, because class always comes into this discussion as well. It's not just about female emancipation. There's a huge issue to do with class, and she did get to know the women that she was dealing with. You know, so these fallen women, these wretches, she actually would sit with and work with and pray with.
Or sometimes took them in.
And sometimes took them in, yeah. So she got to know these people. She wasn't one of these, one of these middle-class women who held salons to discuss how to improve the working class. So she actually got to know these women personally. So she was a very appealing character to write about.
Yeah. And actually, the way that you describe her there, some of her, I kind of hate this term, but I'm going to use it anyway. Some of her ideas are kind of ahead of their time. But I mean, that's often to presuppose that other people weren't having those kinds of thoughts at the time, which they probably were. But the idea that, you know, you can't sort of stop people being sexual. You know, this is an inherent part of, you know, whatever, however sinful you think it is, it's an inherent part of being an adult human being. And by accepting that and accepting our basic nature, then, you know, a happier, healthier, saner society we will have. These are ideas that you see kind of in mainstream about a century later. You know, so she either, you know, a person very much ahead of the time, or there's a whole raft of thought out there that we don't know about where people were kind of expressing these sorts of ideas.
Yeah, I suspect it's the latter, and that we don't have the surviving accounts of sentiments that the status quo or that the establishment did not particularly want aired. Yeah, because we were, I remember with the first couple of books, maybe in the first novel, where there was a critic saying that our character of Sarah seemed too much like a 21st century feminist, and it seemed to be from the assumption that all women at the time were happy with a lot, and it hadn't occurred to them that things might get better, or that they could have a job other than mother or housemaid. And so Marisa looked into that and found evidence of a far more prevalent dissatisfaction among women with their role at that time.
Yeah, there was. unbeknownst to me before I looked into it, in the 1820s, there were huge movements, feminist movements, movements where there was talk of sexual equality, free love, all sorts of stuff that seemed very much ahead of the time, but was going on in the 1820s.
Yeah, and like big speaking tours by certain women who were gathering huge crowds in cities all up and down the UK with discussing these ideas. But the accounts of this are few and far between because it didn't suit the prevailing establishment narrative.
Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
It's time to turn your daydream into your dream job. Wix gives you the power to turn your passion into a moneymaker with a website that fits your unique vision and drives you towards your goals. Let your ideas flow with AI tools that guide you, but give you full control and flexibility. Manage your business from one dashboard and keep it growing with built-in marketing features. Get everything you need to turn your part-time passion into a full-time business. Go to Wix.com.
Well, what I find more and more by reading history and anthropology is that things that are bloody obvious to us now have been obvious to people in the past as well. If you go all the way back to the Peasants' Revolt, there were people there talking in overt kind of terms that we would think of as class warfare in the 21st century, of pointing out, that there is a class system and the people at the top are waging war against the rest of us using, the laws, using military force. And the reason why they're having those thoughts is because it's abundantly clear. It's because you can't not have that thought because it's there. And so I think you're right. I think that there are people, wherever you look in different historical eras, people are having surprisingly modern thoughts, or what we consider to be surprisingly modern thoughts, but they are maybe just perennial ways of seeing the world because it's obvious. It's common sense that people have sexual desire. Perhaps we're just the kind of the misinheritors of a kind of a very patchy record of how things have been, which is, I guess, in a way where historical fiction has a really important role, because historical fiction gets to imagine the gaps in the middle. And I think it's a really, really essential part of how we, because you read a non-fiction history book, you still have to do the imagining.
Yeah. I think. Well, I've always been a fan of good historical fiction for that very reason, that if it's done well and it's researched well, by the time you get to the end of the book, you feel as if you've learned something.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of good historical fiction. And also, I think for people who may be reluctant to pick up a big kind of hefty tome of historical fact, might be more inclined to read historical fiction.
Yeah, creating that narrative and a human experience of it makes it more easily digestible, doesn't it?
I think so. And also, there's obviously some fantastic non-fiction books that do the job just as well. But it depends how detailed they are, how academic they are. Sometimes I don't know. Personally, I find some non-fiction books harder to read than fiction, and maybe it's to do with storytelling and narrative, and that just makes it much easier for us to digest.
I think we also, when with historical fiction, you've got the opportunity to use an element of dramatic irony. You don't want to overdo your 21st century perspective. You don't want that to pollute the thoughts or skew the perspective of your characters at the time. But what you can do is acknowledge your and your readers' awareness of what we know and what wasn't known then. So for all we've just discussed how certain thoughts would have been prevalent back then, but when it comes to medical development or scientific development, there's so many moments where they're this close to understanding something and then get diverted away from it, but we know that they will come to understand it years later.
Yeah.
One of the things Marisa likes to do is take real medical cases and to a modern diagnostician will immediately know that they'll be able to identify what that condition is, that pathology. But our leading doctors at the time, they're describing the symptoms, but they can't put a name to it. But those in the modern age can put that name to it. So you're able to see where we almost made progress or the path of that progress had to go down and why it was so slow.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's really, really important to look at when these things are sort of taught in a basic way. There's the assumption that medical understanding is this kind of linear process, and that there aren't great reversals, and there have been more reversals than there have been steps forward. If we're looking from kind of the Greeks and the Chinese early physicians all the way through to the kind of the pioneers of surgery in the 19th century. So it's a series, in many ways, a kind of a series of accidents strung together.
Yeah.
Which is the title of your next book. There you go. That's right. There you go. So, guys, we'll need to finish in just a moment. But before we do, let's talk about the book. Give it a proper plug. Now, is it available, or are we kind of on the cusp of release? Where are we at?
It's in the shops now.
I think publication day is officially tomorrow.
Okay.
Yes, publication day is the 5th of June.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So it's out and about. It's in the world now.
Yeah.
Super. Well, I will put a link to the book in the podcast blurb below. But as we always say on the podcast, if you can buy it from an independent bookshop or straight from the publisher, please do that, because once that infrastructure of publishers and bookshops goes, it's never coming back. Not ever. And the big online retailers have got enough money as it is. To support those guys. And Marisa and Christopher, it was a delight to talk to you today. It was a fascinating talk. And hopefully, if the series continues, we can chat again, because it would be great to have you back. It really would.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
Thank you.
Okay. Take good care.
Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court, and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common-sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
The new Huggies Snug & Dry are luxuriously soft and ultra-dry. How soft are we talking? Unbelievably soft, irresistibly soft. Doesn't your baby deserve a diaper that's oh so gentle on their tushy? Huggies Snug & Dry helps keep them comfy, cozy, and protected. Experience the unexpected softness and up to 100% leak protection. More parents choose the new Huggies Snug & Dry softness versus the leading premium diaper. Huggies, we got you, baby.